If you Google how to have hobbies with ADHD, people will give you a huge list of hobbies to do. But as our untouched guitars, pianos, sledding gear, and ukuleles will tell you, people with ADHD know what we want to do, we just don't know how to stick to it in the long term. So in this video, let's dive into practical tips that you can use in order to stick to hobbies in the long term. Feel free to comment down below any tips that you have as well. Let's dive into the first tip, which is what I like to call the rotation system. One of the biggest problems with sticking to hobbies in the long term is that we tend to lose interest in doing the same thing repeatedly over a long period of time. The rotation system is a system that I have that helps me keep hobbies fresh and exciting. The way that the system works is fairly simple. I'll basically have 5 slots in my life for hobbies. 3 to 4 of these slots will be static slots. These will be hobbies that don't change very much over time. Then I'll have 1 to 2 dynamic slots, and these will be things that I reserve for my hyperfixations or random new interests that'll pop up over the course of my life that I'll only be interested in for maybe a few weeks at a time. Let me explain how the system works in practice, and it'll be a little bit more clear. Let's say I have 3 static hobbies of playing guitar, reading, and running. And then I have 2 free open slots for whatever hyperfixations I tend to stumble upon. When I end up having free time, what I'll do is I'll just cycle through these hobbies over time. So if I don't have any hyperfixations or anything like that, I'll just pick one of the 3 static ones that I like the most. Being able to cycle through these hobbies will keep it a little bit fresh and exciting. And then having these 1 to 2 slots open for hyperfixations can be really useful. Because let's say while I get super into playing guitar and I'm liking it, all of a sudden I get the urge to play piano nonstop for 2 weeks straight. Because I have these 2 open slots, I can go ahead and assign that slot to playing the piano. And I can switch over to doing that for the few weeks that I get interested in it. And then once I get bored, I can fall back on my static hobbies that I have already. This approach of constantly changing hobbies can help keep them fresh and exciting, and you won't get bored of doing one and then completely abandon it. You can also do this on a smaller scale too. So what I'll sometimes do is when I sit down to do a hobby, I'll maybe play guitar for 10 minutes, and as soon as I start to get bored of doing that, I'll switch over to reading. And then once I start to get bored of that, I'll go ahead and switch over to something like running or walking or whatever hyperfixation I have. Rapidly switching between hobbies can help you maintain your interest in all of them and not abandon any of them. And also building in room for things like hyperfixations can be really helpful because we're going to have them and they bring a lot of joy and add a lot of value to our life. So if we build in room for them, it'll be very helpful. And speaking of hyperfixations, the next tip that I have is tie a lot of your current hobbies to hyperfixations and interests. So for example, if you really want to get into reading or something like that, but you just haven't been able to, quick, easy way that you can change that is tie it to whatever hyperfixation you currently have. For example, recently I got super into new metal music and I wanted to know everything about it. So instead of reading some classic nonfiction book or something that I wasn't really interested in, I bought a book about Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin was someone who produced a ton of new metal music that I was super into, so I read a lot about what he was doing. And that made me enjoy reading a lot more and stick to it in the longer term. You can do this for other stuff as well. If you really want to get into gardening, but your hyperfixation is again something like new metal bands, you can throw on a podcast while you're gardening and it can be about new metal bands. The same thing applies for things like walking, getting exercise in, so on and so forth. Even with a hobby like gaming, I started to play Skate 3 because I've always wanted to get more into gaming, and Skate 3 was something that was related to that current hyperfixation I had at the time. We're driven by what we're interested in, and hyperfixations are a great way to help us continue our hobbies over the long term. I found that this can be really helpful. When I have those 3 static slots that I was talking about in the previous tip, I can use those 2 empty slots for hyperfixations to boost the 3 static slots that I'll have. Hyperfixations and interests are your friend, so make sure that you use them in order to boost existing hobbies that you already have. The third tip that I have is to increase and introduce novelty as often as you can. Constantly try and add new different things to whatever hobbies it is that you already have. Here's what this can look like in practice. Whenever I'm learning guitar and I'm learning one song, if I start to get bored of learning that song, I will add in another song maybe from the same album or by the same artist to learn at the same time. And then once I start to get bored of that song, I'll add in another song, so on and so forth. And I can switch back and forth between the songs so that I don't get bored and I don't lose interest. I do the same thing with books as well. I'll never be reading just one book at a time. I'll have 3 or 4 different books that I'll be reading depending on my mood and depending on what I happen to be interested in that day. For neurotypical people, this is very overwhelming and it's not helpful. But for people with ADHD who have very divergent ways of thinking, when you have several different things that you're doing at the same time that are related within one domain, it can help you draw interesting connections and help you learn faster sometimes. For example, when I'm learning 3 different songs on guitar, I can connect the different techniques that I'm learning within each of those songs to help me play the other songs better. And that synergy can be very exciting for the ADHD brain when you're drawing connections between different things. Same thing with reading books. I'll be reading 3 or 4 different books that are completely unrelated, but I'll start to see parallels within them, and it'll boost my interest in each of those books. This can be a really great way to add stimulation or add novelty, and this can be applied to just about anything. Even when it comes to things like running, you can try and just maybe switch up the types of trails that you're running on. So you can maybe go on sidewalks some days, you can go on tracks some days, you can go on soft surface trails, and you can see how this impacts your legs. You can also maybe try out different types of exercise. So you can maybe go for distance running, you can maybe go for shorter sprints, so on and so forth. Adding variety and novelty is the key to sticking to hobbies in the long term when you have ADHD. The 4th tip I have is ease of access. Any obstacle that gets in the way of you doing your hobby is going to make it harder for you to do. When I say make it easy to access, I mean easy to access. For example, when it comes to playing guitar, I always have have my guitar plugged in, my amp plugged in, and I always have it ready to immediately be turned on. The amount of time that it takes for you to begin a hobby should be less than 10 seconds. Same thing with my piano. My piano is always plugged in and it's always on, ready to go. Same thing with gaming. With things like my PS3, I usually don't play it because it takes like 2 minutes to actually boot up and get started. I pretty much exclusively will play on my Switch or PS4 because I can always just turn those consoles on and be gaming within 10 seconds of starting. While this sounds silly, ADHD brains are known to procrastinate and use any reason to not do something. So the lower the barrier of entry, the easier it will be for us to get started with our hobbies. Physical distance is another thing too. Don't have your hobbies in another room of the house. I have all of the different hobbies that I have within one room, and it helps me stick to them because if I do want to do something like play piano or play guitar, I don't have to go to a different room. I just have to get out of bed and move 5 feet to the right and bam, there's my guitar ready to be played. Another way that we can kind of apply this principle of ease of access is in the difficulty of the things we are doing when we are doing our hobbies. A lot of people with ADHD will dive kind of headfirst into hobbies and they'll want to be doing the most advanced, most difficult stuff right off the bat. But this can be really frustrating and boring and it can make it really hard for us to stick to the habit. For example, when I was starting to learn to play piano or playing guitar, I always wanted to learn the hardest riffs right off the bat and be practicing 10 hours a day. But that's just not realistic. I found that when I stick to kind of easier stuff that's not too difficult to do, I end up being able to stick to something longer term. For example, again, with guitar, I'll kind of try to learn really easy riffs, or with piano, I'll try to learn really easy songs to start off with, and I'll just focusing on learning a large number of songs that are really easy. This is motivating because again, we're making progress, and making progress is something that's really fun. But if you start off trying to do like the hardest thing possible, then you won't see much progress and you'll feel very demotivated. The next tip is to have a mindset shift around hobbies. We want to focus on deregulation over relaxation. One of my favorite channels, How to ADHD, has a great video on why people with ADHD have a hard time relaxing. Oftentimes, the ADHD brain doesn't really want to relax. It wants to be deregulated. So what is the difference between being deregulated and relaxing? A lot of the times when we have ADHD, we have to kind of force our brain and regulate it aggressively throughout the day in order to meet societal expectations. This can leave us feeling drained and exhausted at the end of the day. And instead of deregulating our brains, we'll again regulate them aggressively to try and behave the way neurotypical people do. After a long, stressful day at work, what do neurotypical people do? They relax, they do nothing, they'll kind of watch TV or do something kind of mindless and low stimulation. But for ADHD brains, sometimes something that is quote unquote relaxing might be really overstimulating to someone who doesn't have ADHD. So instead of trying to force yourself to relax or to unwind, just let yourself do whatever it is you want to do at the end of the day when it is your time to have hobbies or to relax. Sometimes relaxation can be starting a side project that's super difficult and super intensive and working on it for 4 hours straight. For me, sometimes relaxing is playing a video game on the hardest difficulty and getting really frustrated at how difficult it is, but enjoying the challenge. A lot of the times throughout the day, we're doing stuff that's really understimulating and boring for us. So at the end of the day, when we do something that's really difficult or really high stimulation, that can actually be what we need in order to recharge and reset our brain, because we're letting our brain do what it wants. This mindset shift is really subtle, where you're not really focusing on unwinding or relaxing, and you're just focusing on letting go of regulation of the brain. But I found that it's worked wonders, because sometimes I will just want to come home and not really do much and do something super light and relaxing like reading. But sometimes if I force myself to do that kind of stereotypical relaxation, it leaves me feeling more burned out. And if I just let myself off the rails and do some kind of big random project in the middle of the night, it helps me a lot with feeling recharged and feeling refreshed. And now the final tip I have is take advantage of your friends. Doing stuff with friends is the best way to stick to hobbies consistently. People with ADHD typically love social interactions and also struggle to find friends. So use hobbies as a great way to find friends. You can do this either by taking existing friends and then asking them if you can join them in hobbies that they do, or asking them if they'd like to join you in hobbies that you have, and picking a regular time every week or every day or something like that in order to do said hobby. There's a reason why D&D is so popular in the ADHD community. This is a perfect hobby for people with ADHD because it's something that happens on a regular basis with a group of people. When you have other people keeping you accountable, it can be a lot easier to stick to hobbies and stuff like that. The way that I kind of do this in my life is whenever I'm going on walks, I'll try and bring along a friend, and I'll kind of have walking in nature as a hobby that I really enjoy. Or I love watching horror movies, so I'll get kind of a group of friends together every month and we'll all watch a horror movie. When I was in high school, we used to have poker nights, and every weekend we'd all get together, bring a ton of food, and just laugh and have a great time playing poker. Ordinarily, on my own, I won't regularly watch horror movies. Going on walks can kind of be a chore, and playing poker is something I've never thought of since I no longer have that group. This really illustrates how powerful friendships are and how powerful having other people there to do your hobbies with you can help you in sticking to those in the long term. So I hope that these tips can help. Again, comment down below any tips that you have that have helped you stick to hobbies as well. I hope this helps. Thank you for watching, and take care.